you thought that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a war unfolding in distant lands, one with no impact on India, well, think again. The war has come home, and not just because one student has tragically been killed in Russian shelling, but because others are reported missing, and they remain the larger geopolitical questions as well. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. Let's take you through the developments at this hour on this global crisis. Russia's foreign minister is now talking about what would happen if there was a World War III, calling it possibly nuclear and destructive. Why is Russia even talking about nuclear war when talks are on? Naveen Shekharappa, the young 21-year-old, tragically killed, and now other students are talking to the Mojo Story about more of their course-mates and friends being untraceable as they walk on foot from east to west. India is demanding a humanitarian passage for the evacuation of our students out of Ukraine. But even as the debate continues on whether India could have done more, is it time for India to jump off that precarious tightrope it's been walking and take a stand against Vladimir Putin? That is our question on the program today. And let us introduce our panel. We're joined by Dr. Radha Kumar, who's a political analyst and a writer and a foreign affairs specialist. Also joining us today from, in fact, Ukraine is Savitri. She's an Indian student in Sumy, where a lot of the fighting is going on, and I'm relieved to see that she's okay. We'll get a first-person account from her. Also, let's bring up our next guest now. Sandip Ghose, a commentator, political analyst, is with us. We're also joined by Dr. Joshi with the Observer Research Foundation. Ambassador Meera Shankar is with us. She's, of course, been India's ambassador to the United States of America, a veteran diplomat. And finally, joining us is strategic affairs expert Zorawar Daulet. Singh, welcome, everybody. If I may start with you, Ambassador, and then I'll come to Savitri right after that. Ambassador Meera Shankar, India's position has been shifting. It started with not even calling this an invasion. It started by using the word violence. Gradually, we seem to be finally taking some sort of subtle sort of position against what Russia is doing. But the Russian foreign minister is now talking about World War III and nuclear war. Can India still remain quiet and on the fence, especially given what's happening with our own students, our own citizens, ma'am? Can we unmute you, ma'am? Ma'am, you're on mute. You need to unmute yourself.
India has reiterated in subsequent discussions in the UN after abstaining in the Security Council, it reiterated that the principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty have to be respected because they are the very fundamentals on the basis of which the UN Charter was put in place. They are an essential element of the UN Charter. India has called for a cessation of violence immediately and a resumption of dialogue and talks as the only way forward. It has sought the safety of Indian students and has put in place mechanisms for their evacuation. And we have also responded to Ukraine by sending humanitarian assistance, mainly by way of pharmaceuticals and medicines in this crisis. So you can see that to some extent, the nuances of the position that India is taking have shifted. The basic position continues because we have continued to abstain on many of the other resolutions that have come up in various UN fora since the UN Security Council discussion.
Is it enough? Is it enough?
I suppose each country views the situation from the perspective of what it perceives its national interests to be. And clearly for India, which has strategic equities in Russia, there are important issues at stake. You may say that we've been slow to address these issues, but the fact is that today this is where we are, where 60% of our defense equipment is still of Russian origin. And at the same time, you have Russia and China and Pakistan, in one sense, coming together. Russia being pushed more towards China because of Western pressure and sanctions since 2013-14, and now I think this process may accelerate. And on the other hand, new openings between Pakistan and Russia because of the China factor and the Belt and Road Initiative. The situation for India is not comfortable if we are to create a solid phalanx of Russia, China, and Pakistan on our border. So the sense here is that while we may have serious concerns about what Russia has done and whether this is the way to handle disputes between nations, we will avoid condemning Russia or pushing it into a corner.
Yeah, I think, thank you for that. Let me open this up for the rest of the panel now. I do want to hear from Savitri, who's on the ground in Ukraine, but I'll get an initial comment from Manoj on whether he sees the complexity that the ambassador says and that sees and that many diplomats have been arguing in favor of. Manoj, the point, of course, has been made about Western hypocrisy, about how the world did not take the same position when Iraq was invaded, before that when Afghanistan was invaded, that Western countries have never stood with India against China's incursions. Why is there this pressure then on India to take a position which is unambiguous and non-complex? You would say what?
In 1999, we condemned NATO outright. We said it appeared that in the UN resolution, and we were not even members of the Security Council. See, we said very clearly that it appeared that NATO believed itself to be above the law, and that was deeply uncomfortable. So I'm not going to quote the whole thing, but what I'm trying to say is that in 1999, in a similar situation, we were ready to make an outright condemnation of someone who had breached vital international law. This time around, we have been fumbling. We have taken a marginal position. We are members of the Security Council. We could have taken a staked out a clear-cut position. We may have had a third position, not necessarily for the US or for Russia, but we should have been nimble enough to come out with a third-party position on this, which would have categorically, because it is in our national interest that this war end as soon as possible, because we've seen one of our students killed, and now there is talk of nuclear war. So whether you like it or not, this is going to affect us. And I'm not even going into things like oil prices and global inflation and Indian defense supplies and all that. I think, all politics has a moral as well as a real politic dimension. And I think we probably somewhere are missing out the moral dimension.
Okay, I think that is something very important you flagged about extraordinary statements about potential nuclear conflict that are emerging from no less than Russia's foreign minister today, and that has to be taken around the panel. But first to Savitri. Savitri, सबसे पहले आप हमारे ऑडियंस को बताइए आप अभी कहाँ हैं और आप आसपास क्या देख रही हैं?
अभी मैं सुमी में हूँ, यूक्रेन में। अब तक हमें कोई भी इवैक्यूएशन के लिए कंफर्मेशन नहीं आई है। बस कहा जा रहा है कि वो ट्राई कर रही है अपनी बेस्ट तरीके से, लेकिन अभी तक हमारे पास कोई भी कंफर्मेशन नहीं है यहाँ से निकलने के लिए कि हम कैसे निकलेंगे। सराउंडिंग में एक्चुअली यहाँ से हमेशा रशियन के वेपन्स और ट्रूप सब पास होते हैं। 50 किलोमीटर ही दूर है रशिया से हमारी सिटी। तो हमेशा यहाँ से जब भी जाते हैं तो स्ट्रीट पे फायरिंग होती है, ब्लास्ट होता है, विच इज़ वेरी अनसर्टेन। हमें भी नहीं पता होता कि कब क्या हो जाएगा। सडनली सायरन रिंग होता है और हमें शेल्टर में भागना पड़ता है और कभी भी हो जाता है। Still I'm sitting here, but I don't know when it will ring.
Yeah, you're a medical student, Sumy. Savitri, you're a medical student in Sumy. Savitri, are you able to hear me? आप मेरी आवाज सुन पा रही हैं सावित्री? आप मेडिकल स्टूडेंट हैं मैम? Okay, we're on हाँ जी, सावित्री, आपको मेरी आवाज आ रही है तो आगे बोलिए आप।
जी अभी आ रही है।
ओके, आप मुझे ये बताइए, आपने
हेलो।
कहा कि सायरन्स हैं, हाँ जी, आपने कहा सायरन्स हैं, बॉम्ब्स हैं, आपका घर कहाँ है इंडिया में? आपका घर कहाँ है इंडिया में?
एक्चुअली मैं मुंबई से बिलोंग करती हूँ, थाने डिस्ट्रिक्ट से।
हम्म। और
हेलो।
आपकी बहुत, हाँ हाँ, मुझे आवाज आ रही है आपकी, प्लीज आप बोलते रहिए। आप अभी सरकार से क्या मदद चाहती हैं, सावित्री? ओके, सावित्री इज इन अ वॉर
एक्चुअली
जोन, सो यू, या
आवाज़
बोलिए
कट हो
बोलिए।
रही है
आई नो,
आपकी।
आप ही बोलिए, मैं कुछ नहीं बोलूंगी। आप सिर्फ ये बताइए, आप सरकार से अभी क्या मदद चाहती हैं इस समय?
मैं तो बस यही बोलूँगी कि हमें जल्दी से यहाँ से इवैक्यूएट किया जाए, क्योंकि हमको नहीं पता कि किस समय क्या हो जाएगा। बिकॉज़ हमको कुछ पता ही नहीं है कि कहाँ ब्लास्ट हो जाता है और पूरा वाइब्रेट होने लगता है। पूरी बिल्डिंग वाइब्रेट हो जाती है, हम बहुत ज़्यादा पैनिक हो जाते हैं, फिर शेल्टर में चले जाते हैं, फिर थोड़ी-सी सिचुएशन ठीक हो जाती है, फिर रूम पे आते हैं, थोड़ा कुछ खाते हैं, फिर पता नहीं कब सायरन बज जाती है, वापस चले जाते हैं। और जो भी इवैक्यूएशन हो रही है सब वेस्टर्न साइड से हो रही है, जहाँ पे कुछ अभी इतना इश्यू नहीं है। और हम पहले से ही यहाँ पे फँसे हुए हैं, लेकिन ईस्टर्न साइड की कोई बात ही नहीं कर रहा है, खारकिव और सुमी की। और यहाँ से निकलने के लिए हमारे पास ट्रेन नहीं है अवेलेबल, ना ही रोड्स है, क्योंकि जगह-जगह पे रशियन चेक पॉइंट्स है। तो हमें एडवाइस किया गया है एम्बेसी के तरफ से कि आपको निकलना ही नहीं है। अगर आपको कुछ हो जाता है तो हम रिस्पॉन्सिबल नहीं हैं, आपको बस शेल्टर में ही रहना है। तो हमारे पास कोई ऑप्शन ही नहीं है कि हम यहाँ से निकले, बिकॉज़ ईस्टर्न से वेस्टर्न बॉर्डर तक हमारे लिए 15 किलोमीटर तक पड़ता है और रशियन बॉर्डर से हमसे 50 किलोमीटर दूर है। तो इट इज़ नॉट पॉसिबल टू क्रॉस दैट बॉर्डर फॉर अस।
Yes. We're all praying for your safe return and stay with us. Please do understand that Savitri is speaking right now from a war zone that is being bombed. She's in a shelter. And so if the line goes up and down, I'm sure our audience and our panel today will understand. Let's bring in Radha, Zorawar, and Sandip. Radha, go ahead.
Well, as I said earlier to you, I'm just so sorry about the situation you're in. I wish we could have done something earlier. I'm glad the government is trying so hard now. I believe that there is an assurance that you might be able to be evacuated across the Russian border. So let us hope that that will happen soon for your sake. Having said that, my own feeling is that we should have taken a strong position against invasion right in the beginning. And I say this both for moral and for strategic reasons. Putin's Russia has been an extremely unreliable ally for many years now. They have delayed deliveries, they have bumped up prices, they tried to keep us out of Afghanistan talks. They have done very little to reason with China. They certainly haven't taken very strong positions in our favor. That's point number one. Point number two for me is that a weakening of Putin will also affect China. And that is, in a way, a net good for us. If China is emboldened further, then there is going to be a lot more global criticism of China. If China is not emboldened, then perhaps their attention may be focused now a little more on their own troubles with Russia. So on the whole, I would say that would be a net good as well. On Ukraine itself,
can you hold that? Can you hold that thought? Let me just get Zorawar and Sandip to come in with first reactions, and then we'll go deeper into this. Zorawar, I saw what you were arguing online, and a lot of people are making the point about Western hypocrisy. But Manoj Joshi makes the point about a moral force and that realpolitik and sort of your moral center as a nation. You have to find a kind of match there. Do you believe that we have found that match in our response? And I agree with Ambassador Meera Shankar that response has not been static, it's been shifting. Has it shifted enough?
Yeah, so absolutely. So the idea of sovereignty and territorial integrity is, of course, the heart of the modern international order, right? So, but I also believe that the Indian position is also framed by other world order questions, such as the right to security, the inadmissibility of alliances to keep on sort of expanding. So I think there's a bigger context here. This particular conflict, of course, it is ultimately Russian use of force. We can't put it in any other perspective. But the lead up to this, if anyone claims that they're surprised by what is happening, then they've obviously tuned out of what's happening in European security for the last 30 years, and certainly since 2014, when you had a very brazen attempt by the West to convert what could have been a neutral middle path bridge to connect the East and the West, which is a country of 40 million people in Ukraine, should have actually been, I mean, look at it. Energy pipelines from Russia flow to Europe through Ukraine. Yeah, they go back to the Cold War. This state should never have been given the illusion and the possibility that it's going to enter into a one-sided alliance at the expense of Russian security. I think there's a massive debate going on in Russia for the last several decades, and I think it reached a tipping point where it was believed that not doing anything would in fact create a more vicious security crisis in the coming years, which could actually escalate to a nuclear war. So this idea is not far-fetched. And I think what the Russians are doing brutally, but they are now putting a stop to that. I think the opportunity now lies for India and for the United States is to try and find a possibility where you include Russia in this new security architecture. After all, you look at the way Washington deals with Beijing. You have such a more complex, nuanced, sophisticated approach to managing China, right? I mean, you have nobody's talking of containment of China. Why is this idea of Russophobia so ingrained when you had a large group of Westernizers in Russia who wanted to touch? So we've now reached the end of the road there, but I think the Indian position, I would go beyond just this idea of saying we are being friendly to Russia. I don't think we believe in a world order which is going to be built on a single pillar and an exclusive security system. Our idea is an inclusive world order where you do not put alliances and leave states with no other choice.
I hear you, but I wonder if that explains why we abstained, for example, when it came to calling for an emergency session of the United Nations General Assembly. But I'll come back on that in the second round. Let me just bring in Sandip. Sandip, there's a lot of debate on whether the government has done enough to evacuate the students. You heard the heartbreaking account from Savitri. Should this have been actioned earlier? But even worse, you have kind of tone-deaf comments about how it's only the not bright students who go to Ukraine to study. You've had the father of someone who's just lost his son having to come on camera and say, my son got 97% and he's still going to get a seat here in a medical college because you need crores to get that admission. I mean, what's going on? Is the government handling the narrative sensitively, you think, Sandip? You're on mute, Sandip. Sorry, Sandip, you're on mute. Yeah.
Barkha, here we have all foreign affairs experts, and I can't even pretend to be anything close to that. So I'll take a purely layman and human response to the whole issue. First of all, I think a very key word is priority. And I think our government has repeatedly emphasized what is the priority. And just like in other countries, they will be very sensitive about body bags coming in. Our first priority is to get the students back. I don't think I've written an article today in the first post where I said it doesn't matter whether the students didn't heed our advisories in time or the government acted late. Right now, the first priority is to get them out. And to say at this juncture, Whether they're doing enough or not, I don't think many of us are in a position to comment. But from whatever broad information we have, I think what's happening is what could have happened, that, the Western borders are more open, so you could take people out. You've got those neighboring countries, Poland, Romania, Moldova, and in the eastern side, you had a problem. And one of the reasons today, even if the Russian ambassador has made a comment of allowing a safe passage, and we are able to talk to them, because all of us, don't know, all of us, barring some of them, and Ambassador Meera Shankar, what are the conversations which are happening behind the, in the back channels? Pankaj Saran, who was the deputy NSA, he was the ambassador in Russia till recently. So I'm sure we also have our connections there. Now, today, to get that passage, itself would not have been possible.
I agree, it's not easy, but do we need tone deaf comments about whether these are smart children? Why did they not come back?
No,
I mean, these are 21-year-old kids.
No, whose comments are those? Today in our country, thanks to social media, is very, and also this 24/7 television and everything is very difficult to contain this kind of comments. Somebody I saw commented that, who should have the father spoken to the prime minister? But the prime minister himself called the father up. Okay, so he could have spoken to the prime minister. That's not this. The government is doing its own bit. You may have questions about whether these are photo ops, whether these were necessary. There can be a variety of reasons, and I think one reason the government has to resort to these kind of more visible action, showing people that a prime minister is chairing a number of high-level meetings, etc. Because you make all kinds of people are making all kinds of insinuation that he is campaigning and not doing anything about it.
Yeah.
Today, Mamata Banerjee said, I have come here to campaign, but I've come here after completing my job, almost like a school child saying that, I'm playing now because I finished my homework. Now, prime minister is doing multitasking. So they have to put these things in perspective. And I can understand, the situation of, and all sympathies for this young girl and similar people who are in their position. I would relate it again in a very layman's perspective, what happens at the beginning of the lockdown. A lot of people would have felt helpless being somewhere. Now the question is whether they leave that place and start walking, which is even more dangerous, or they'll have to go through a bit of this.
Let me come in on this point.
There are children, the nation's children.
Yes, who are walking. There are children. I want to come in on that. There are children who are walking. They've been talking to us this morning. We had a first-person account from a young woman whose sister, in fact, is a journalist who walked. Yesterday, we interviewed a student who walked that 15 kilometers. Savitri, आपसे पूछना चाहूंगी, अभी तो आपको एडवाइजरी मिली है कि आप जहां हैं वहीं रहिए. आपके बहुत से दोस्त पैदल निकल गए. आपने भी सोचा क्या पैदल निकलने की, कि आपको लगा, बहुत डर लगा क्योंकि आसपास सब जगह बॉम्ब्स गिर रहे हैं, शेलिंग हो रही है? अगर आप मुझे सुन पा रही है तो.
यस मैम, एक्चुअली हमारे सिटी से अभी तक तो कोई भी नहीं निकला है, बिकॉज रशियन ने स्टार्टिंग में ईस्टर्न पार्ट से स्टार्ट किया था, तो उन्होंने सुमी को मतलब हर जगह से अटैक कर लिया था. सो हमारे पास कोई मतलब किसी ने नहीं कहा कि निकलो या कुछ भी. यहाँ से हमारे पास ऑप्शन ही नहीं था कि हम यहाँ से निकल सके, बिकॉज रशियन ट्रूप्स पहले ही यहाँ पे आ गए थे, तो वो बहुत ज्यादा रिस्की था. हमारे सिटी से कोई भी इंडियन स्टूडेंट अभी तक निकला नहीं है.
और आपको अभी सबसे ज्यादा मुश्किल क्या हो रही है सावित्री? एक तो सेफ्टी है. What about food and water?
Yeah, there is very limited food. हम जब सुपरमार्केट में रिस्क लेके भी अगर जाएंगे तो फूड अवेलेबल नहीं है जो हमें चाहिए खाने के लिए. ब्रेड्स आर नॉट अवेलेबल इवन. बहुत लंबी लाइन लगनी पड़ती है और स्ट्रीट फाइटिंग्स बहुत ज़्यादा हो रही है, और पूरी सिविलियंस भी यहाँ की गन यूज कर रही है, वेपन्स यूज कर रही है. वो नहीं देख रही है कि कौन क्या कर रहा है. स्ट्रीट फाइट में कोई कुछ नहीं देख रहा, तो हमारे लिए बहुत रिस्की है कि हम अपने रूम से भी बाहर जाए. तो फूड्स वगैरह भी अवेलेबल नहीं है. बस वन टाइम फूड ऑल्सो वी गेट वेरी इन अ डिफिकल्ट सिचुएशन, लाइक एक टाइम का खाना भी सही से नहीं मिल पा रहा है. So
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know when they will take action.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sorry. What can we say? But we're sorry. We hope you get home very safe. I want to bring in the ambassador. What is the, in some ways we have appeared to much of the Western world to be soft on Putin. What is the use, as it were, of that if we can't even get a safe passage into places like Sumy to take our people out? Isn't that something that should have been leveraged right in the beginning, ma'am?
Yes, I think we should have prepared a contingency plan. There was the expectation in some quarters that this is diplomatic posturing by Putin. It's a threat rather than an actual invasion, which is likely. But nevertheless, given the situation, contingency planning should have been there in terms of how you will reinforce the strength of your missions, because the missions in these countries are very small, what kind of communications nerve centers you will set up to handle the crisis on a 24-hour basis. Having said that, it is a very difficult situation and there are no easy answers. So I suppose the government is trying to do the best that it can in a very, very difficult situation. They have sent planes to evacuate the students, now press the Air Force planes as well. They've also sent ministers to the neighboring states. That actually becomes an additional point of pressure on the missions because they have to look after the ministers rather than being focused on the evacuation. What they really need is reinforcement of functional staff which can handle phones, 24-hour call center, which can link up with the Indian missions and have constant communication. I mean, these are some of the measures that perhaps we could have put in place, but now we are trying to do whatever can be done in the current context. The government is discussing with Russia how to get safe passage for the students. I don't know whether institutions like the Indian Red Cross, the International Red Cross could be pressed in, because normally in such war situations, they can talk to the warring parties to create a safe passage to evacuate all foreign nationals who are caught in Ukraine in the midst of this conflict.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me bring in Manoj now. Manoj, I think one of the important points that Ambassador Meera Shankar makes is perhaps an initial misreading or a miscalculation by much of the world that either misread Putin's intent to go through with this or thought it would be confined to the separatist regions that were initially given legitimacy by him, and now his foreign minister is talking about possible nuclear war.
Well, that is correct, that almost everyone, I think, miscalculated, including the Chinese. But by the way, the Americans are the people who have been saying consistently that Putin intends to invade Ukraine. And Biden has been saying this for quite some time. I think a month and a half, 2 months, 3 months. They've been saying that the forces are being collected there. They're going to invade. They even gave a date. They even gave a potential plan. So, but the problem was with us, meaning, and when I say us, countries that were friendlier to Russia, China. China is another country which I think really thought that Putin would not go through with this. So now the problem is China actually thought that just by bringing the situation to the brink that he had brought it, Putin had already made his point. And perhaps they are right, that perhaps Putin has now overplayed his hand by this war. And certainly from the point of view of the rest of the world, it's not just overplayed his hand. He has also demonstrated himself to be a danger to global stability, global peace. Besides the nuclear thing, I'm seeing a huge potential for economic upheaval as an outcome of this. I mean, say oil prices being just one part of this.
Yeah.
And just by the way, I want to make one more point. As far as where this young lady comes from, that town has already been bypassed, but it's in the front line, and in ahead of them, the Russian forces. The only route that out to Kiev the Russian troops are advancing along that. So I don't think there's much of a chance that anything can be done at that particular point.
Yeah, and that's why I asked whether we and it's not just India, as you said, maybe large parts of the world actually misread where this was headed. Zorawar, before I get Radha in, please do respond in a sense to the arguments you've heard about how this is not only about morality and sentimentalism and absolute principles. How is it good for Indian interests to basically be seen to be standing in Putin's side, at Putin's side at this time?
Yeah, so purely from a geopolitical perspective, of course, you have a strong bilateral relationship, which is vital to Indian military modernization, etc. That's there. I think the bigger picture is India still visualizes this multipolar world that's coming into being, which certainly is coming into being. And one of those pillars, other than Beijing, China, Washington, the United States, is Russia. And of course, India would like to be the fourth or fifth pole in the coming decade. So I think by isolating Russia, or weakening Russia, the Indian worldview, at least as far as my understanding is, that it would leave the world completely in the hands of the United States and the Chinese to sort of dominate from a G2 sense. So I think that's the bigger picture sort of chessboard, where if we had a possibility to play some sort of a mediating role, diplomatic role, is to try and find some sort of a modus vivendi between the West and Russia, even after this crisis. After all, the first Cold War did not need to happen in the direction that it took, right? It took on a vicious state of militarization on both sides. The 50s, as we recall, you're talking of Lavrov threatening nuclear use. You had President Eisenhower in 1953-54 threatening the use of nuclear weapons on the Taiwan Straits crisis. So we don't need to go back there, right? You can still solve this. Ukraine that is neutral with its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and a bridge between the West and East. After all, the Chinese have been fantasizing of connectivity right to Germany, which is going to come through Russia and Ukraine, right? So what happens to all these plans? If you're talking of a globalized, interdependent world, then how can you have the largest country on the planet outside it, right? So, and let me
bring in Radha on that. Yeah, you made that point, like how... Sorry, I'm interrupting, but to not have Russia part of that architecture is the point that you made, and I just let Radha to respond to that. Radha, please go ahead.
To use a very dull old phrase of Musharraf's, it takes two to tango. And Putin has shown very clearly that he does not wish to be part of a global interconnected security architecture. Having said that, I would say that there was a point at which, under the NATO Partnership for Peace, Russia could have, and under previous presidencies, was actually making a little progress on Partnership for Peace, which might perhaps have helped provide at least some level of confidence building. But Putin stopped all of that. Now, I don't think it is possible to get away from analyzing the situation today, not only in regard of Russia, but also China. Both Putin and Xi are absolutely openly determined to reunify lands that they consider belonged to Russia or China, whether on the basis of ethnicity or language or ideology. This is their determination. And we would be extremely foolish to ignore that.
Well, very divided views on this in this conversation itself. Sandip, I'll give you a quick comment on the handling thus far. You're fair to say that any people want to see their government doing something, and therefore these images of the ministers and so on. But you heard what the ambassador said. The embassies would be better served to be left alone with a lot more staff than to be bothered with protocol at this hour. I think there's merit in that. But certainly tone-deaf comments, saying so-and-so opposed the citizenship legislation. Today, he's asking to be evacuated. Every Indian citizen has the right to criticize their government and still expect protection from the state. I think this is the kind of commentary that young people don't need this time. They're in the middle of a war zone.
No, young people certainly don't need. And what Ambassador Meera Shankar said was precisely what was my reaction on a tweet as soon as this was announced. And I came from a very corporate standpoint where I know if the bosses arrive at the time there is a crisis in the plant or somewhere, it becomes a distraction. And so good leaders know how to stay away while keeping, a tab of what's happening. Secondly, I think the point about people not anticipating, I think that's a fair point. And I'll make two comments on this. And Dr. Joshi talked about, Putin reading, Biden reading it right, and Americans reading it right this time. But I think the Americans had also, compromised their own credibility earlier with the kind of stuff they said in Iraq, etc. So a lot of people probably took their warnings with a pinch of salt. But having said that, what is the situation today? I don't think we should fall into the same trap to think nothing more will happen. There is no further escalation which will happen. And I think there has to be a contingency plan for that. And we cannot expect our young children, or for that matter, their families, who are spread all over the country, in some people in small towns, small villages, to prepare for it. So nationally, we'll have to think about what to do, because we cannot afford, the situation. And there are realities, as Dr. Joshi again was pointing out. Sumy is a place where how do you take people out? So that will be a diplomatic challenge. And I don't think, my only submission is we shouldn't make the government's task more difficult by all kinds of, like Akhilesh Yadav showing, pictures of people which we don't know whether they're from UP or not, trying to make political capital of it in the elections, and those sort of things. I think that's what puts pressure on an operating government.
I would agree that the opposition shouldn't do that. I would argue that the government should not do it either, and that applies to all parties. At this moment, if we can come out of these pictures now, let us take a moment to think about Savitri.
I will hold some responsible people also, accountable. Like a very well-known economist sitting in America starts comparing this situation with migrants coming back home during lockdown, and say government failed then and government is failing now. This is not the moment to make those comments. I think we should exercise some degree of restraint and sobriety.
I just want to end with thinking of this young student who's with us today, Savitri, who is in Sumy, which Dr. Joshi just explained is right at the front line. She's described at great length that there are Russian troops and Russian checkpoints everywhere and she can't get out. And I think for India, this has to be the priority. The geopolitics will be alongside, could come later. It's complex. This country its country's strategic affairs establishment does not necessarily agree on what should happen next, but everybody agrees that our kids need to come back home. So let's focus our energy there. In the meantime, thanking all of you, and we'll keep an eye on this story. And Savitri, we wish you lots of luck, and our prayers are with you. We hope you come back home and reunite with your family very soon. We'll keep you in our thoughts, all of you. Thank you very much for watching. See you tomorrow. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo's Story and support independent, robust journalism.